Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
Federal News Network, helping feds meet their mission.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Thursday, May 21st. I'm your host, Eric White, filling in for Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up this hour of the Federal Drive, having expertise doesn't always mean the system knows what to do with it. Plus, after a tough year for federal senior executives, new leadership at SEA is looking at what comes next. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. The Department of Health and Human Services carried out widespread layoffs a year ago. Now it's sending out a second wave of reduction in force notices. HHS says these are more targeted layoffs, targeting employees it missed when their offices and programs were eliminated last year. All of this is happening as HHS embarks on a hiring surge. Federal News Network's Jory Heckman has been keeping up with everything going on at the agency. Jory, welcome.
Hey, Eric.
So let's start off with the layoffs last year. You widely reported on them. How big were the last year's layoffs at HHS, just for scale?
That's right. So HHS carried out a reduction in force of about 10,000 employees last year. And it also, through voluntary separation incentives, the deferred resignation offer, the early retirement offers, it got another 10,000 employees to voluntarily leave the organization in the lead up to those RIFs. So altogether, a reduction of about 20,000 employees last April of 2025, and they reduced their workforce from about 82,000 employees to about 62,000 employees.
Where did that stand as far as ranking? We saw a lot of RIF notices and fork in the road, people taking the buyouts. Where did that stand as far as other agency RIF notices going out?
I think it ranks up there as one of the more substantial reductions in force in a year that was pretty full of these kinds of situations happening at all kinds of different agencies. HHS, of course, is a large federated agency, has a lot of different components, but even when you look at it that way, this is still a real significant reduction in manpower for HHS, and we have seen the consequences of that. There have been, some entire programs and offices closed as a result of those RIFs. Just basically HHS saying that there are some offices that were around that were no longer aligned with the Trump administration's priorities.
Yeah, and in that vein, it seems as if the agency is not finished. What are these RIF notices that are going out now to some of those programs that were eliminated and just some folks were left off the table because of oversight? What happened there?
Yeah, so it's really more of the latter situation. HHS recently notified about 78 employees, so a couple dozen employees here, saying that they are also getting reduction in force notices. This is a follow-on to the RIFs that we've just been talking about that occurred last year. Essentially, these are employees who worked in programs and offices that were completely eliminated through last year's RIFs, but through some quirk of the data, they were not let go when these offices and programs were terminated. And so they were reassigned to other places. They kind of flew under the radar for a bit. But HHS at this late date has realized that they were working in programs that they've closed. And they are also telling these employees that they no longer have a job at the department.
And HHS at the same time is embarking now on a hiring surge. Are they just trying to backfill some of the folks that may have left from taking the buyouts, or is there other initiatives that they are trying to advance in these hirings?
Yeah, so what we've learned from HHS top officials in all of this is that they were not so much concerned about the headcount number, the quantity of employees at HHS, but they were looking at employees who were politically aligned with the Trump administration, who are willing to support the administration's priorities. This is all coming from HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. He told the He told appropriators on the Hill recently just as much. He said that HHS is looking for a better group of people. He says that people who were at the agency in the early days of the Trump administration were not on board with his Make America Healthy Again agenda. And so that this was a clearinghouse situation where the people they now have on board are more aligned with that vision. I mentioned earlier that after these rifts and all these workforce reductions, HHS had a headcount of about 62,000 employees. Currently, they're closer to 72,000 employees, and they're looking to hire about another 1,200 employees as well. So they're actually going to slightly increase their headcount compared to where they were before these rifts.
Speaking here with Federal News Network reporter Jory Heckman. All right, so that gives us a little bit of insight of where things are heading. What else is going on as it pertains to HHS's workforce as of today?
Well, we've caught a glimpse of what's going to happen next with the rebrand of Schedule F, which is better known these days as Schedule Policy/Career. That's going to be moving out for the department and soon the rest of the federal government here. What we've seen in a memo is that HHS is telling employees that hundreds of GS-15 positions will be reclassified as Schedule Policy Career fairly soon. To catch you up on all of this, Schedule Policy Career is a new classification for federal employees, largely in policymaking positions. They would be moved to basically at-will designations. They would be easier to fire under this new designation, and they'd have fewer appeals rights as well. So that's something that's really gotten a lot of attention, and we're seeing that that's soon to come for HHS.
What comes next? What will we be talking to you about next time we have you on to discuss HHS workforce initiatives?
Well, we'll soon see the next steps in terms of implementation of Schedule Policy Career. This is something that all agencies are working on right now. They've been gathering lists of who would be converted to this new designation, and none of this goes into effect without President Donald Trump issuing an executive order saying that these lists that he's received, these are the positions that will be converted, and that will be the reality going forward. So we're going to be keeping an eye out for when that executive order does cross his desk.
All right, you can be sure we're going to hold you to that. Federal News Network reporter Jory Heckman, thank you as always.
Thanks, Eric.
Up next, having expertise doesn't always mean the system knows what to do with it. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. I'm Eric White filling in for Terry.
Tune in Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. for the Innovation in Government Show, sponsored by Carasoft. Hear from the industry leaders advancing the technologies shaping how agencies modernize secure operations and deliver better services. Innovation in Government covers what is changing now, what is working from cybersecurity and cloud to data, AI, and emerging technologies. Listen to Innovation in Government, Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. on Federal News Network. Search Innovation in Government.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. I'm Eric White filling in for Terry. The Air Force has spent years building China-related expertise, but researchers find the personnel system doesn't always reward or retain that specialization. That leaves a gap between what strategy calls for and how careers actually play out. Dr. Miriam Matthews and Christina Garafola from the RAND Corporation joined Federal Drive host Terry Gerton earlier to discuss their analysis.
Dr. Matthews, I'd like to start with you. This report talks about how the Air Force is adjusting to the China threat. For years now, national strategy documents have been very clear about China in our strategic thinking. Why has the gap been so hard for the Air Force to close?
It's been hard because it's not a single program fix. So it cuts across this China expertise challenge across education, training, assignments, promotions, language programs, regional experience, and so forth. So all those different systems don't always work together and move together. And there's no single indicator that the Air Force can use to be able to identify relevant expertise. So who is a China expert in the U.S. Air Force. There are lots of different ways to think about that. So even just that one question, it becomes a challenge. Basically, it's just many different systems meant for many different purposes.
Did there used to be pathways to develop this kind of deep regional expertise, and they're just not used anymore?
Previously, there have been different programs that have been forth to try and train people and get them spun up on regional expertise. As part of our report, we looked into how expertise was developed, both for the Cold War and for expertise in the Middle East, to try and learn some of the strengths of different past programs and also what the various limitations were. So there have been different programs, and the kind of short story toward all of that is that they all had limitations. They were all dealing with these various systems, and it becomes hard to mainstream and come up with a coherent system and picture for developing expertise.
Your report, I think, actually goes a little bit farther, Dr. Matthews, and says that specialization has actually become a career risk in the Air Force. Explain
Indeed.
how they need this specialization, but it's actually not a career benefit.
Well, that was one of the clearest themes that we found, both across what we saw in terms of our interviews, the data, and looking into past cases. So the Air Force has said that it needs to develop regional knowledge, but historically, people who specialize in something, they face different trade-offs in the traditional career progression. So during the Cold War and the global war on terror, regional expertise was often perceived as a risk, as a career risk, because it could pull individuals, like it could pull officers away from the assignments and milestones that promotion systems usually tend to reward. So if they're a pilot, regional expertise may not be the focus for their career progression, and that could cause a risk. If they have this regional focus, they have to choose. Do they want to be a specialized, fantastic pilot, or do they want to be a specialized, fantastic regional expert? So we heard similar concerns when we were conducting interviews with various individuals across the Air Force. So there are highly motivated airmen who may want to build China expertise and really want to actively understand China, whether it be language, history, strategy. But if the systems aren't clearly tracking expertise, they're not demonstrating value for that for the various career fields, not just, for example, for foreign area officer kind of thing, and they're not using that expertise effectively. Instead, it's just whatever the immediate need is, and that might not be the regional expertise, then they can reasonably worry that that specialization that they want or that they've started to develop will hurt rather than help their careers.
Ms. Garofalo, the report makes a deep comparison to how airmen were managed during the Cold War era. What lessons did you learn from that comparison?
Absolutely. So we saw a number of strengths during the Cold War, both in the kind of doctrinal focus. So, many of the U.S. Armed Forces, including the Air Force, were gaining operational depth and knowledge across their doctrine focused on the Soviet Union. So there was specific operational knowledge built up over time about how the Soviet forces operated. And then that was disseminated through doctrinal publications about how the U.S. Armed Forces should fight. And operationally, we also had multiple familiarization pathways for U.S. and Air Force forces, not only being stationed abroad, but rotating through Europe and getting operational training from veteran personnel on the ground that had years or even decades of experience learning about Soviet forces, Soviet tactics, changes in how the Soviet military might fight. So you had a doctrinal focus that was clear, and then you had units that are being exposed to different types of Soviet operations, building that expertise across the force.
How does that compare to how this kind of expertise is or isn't being built today?
Sure. So we see those as strengths of the Cold War system. Some of the weaknesses, unfortunately, do resonate from that period too. So one, as Miriam already talked about, there seemed to be a lack of strategic human capital planning at that time, where, again, regional experience was not tied to promotion board metrics. We also see issues within the system today for that, as well as ad hoc practices. So there wasn't a lot of these programs or knowledge in the classroom, for example, to learn more about the Soviet threat were optional or opting in by the individual service person. We also did a look at the global war on terror, where the training and doctrinal publications caught up after many forces were already deployed in the region. So they were learning on the go during their deployments rather than getting instruction and education prior to being there.
Dr. Miriam Matthews is a senior behavioral and social scientist. Christina Garofalo is a senior policy researcher, both at the RAND Corporation. Dr. Matthews, let me come back to you. Your report notes that even when people acquire China-relevant skills, the system often fails to use them. You mentioned a little bit earlier about identifiers and various systems. What happens to this expertise? Where does it get lost?
So what happens is that the Air Force loses basically operational value of their investment. So people develop this expertise, whether it be through their own motivation and just getting into degree programs or taking courses or participating in training simply out of their own motivation, or they might be encouraged to do that earlier in their careers. And then what ends up happening is that the Air Force, by not using the skills and the knowledge that they developed, that it risks wasting talent and motivation. So someone might invest years developing language skills and regional knowledge, expertise, better understanding the history and different strategies used in China. But if the Air Force cannot identify China experts within its service and cannot track them and doesn't know what skills that they have, then it can't put them in roles where those skills would have the greatest impact, where they would matter the most. And so the overall institution does not get the benefit of this knowledge and this expertise. And then from the individual airman's perspective, it's really discouraging. And we heard that again and again. It's just very discouraging to try so hard and to be so motivated and really want to provide this unique value, and then to have that not used, it's just very demoralizing and demotivating for the individual airman, which has issues with retention, especially when outside of the Air Force, that kind of knowledge and skills is highly in demand.
Ms. Garofalo, let me come back to you. What distinguishes units that can successfully integrate this China expertise from those who treat it as optional?
Sure, I can give two types of examples. So one is some units and forces might be operating in a region, whether that's the Indo-Pacific or others, where the Chinese military is also operating, or they may be operating with allies and partners who are also operating in proximity to the Chinese military. So commanders or units that are able to leverage their China talent may be working together with allies and partners that have shared experiences or common experiences, and they're able to build trust or capability with another country and learn from their experiences too, dealing with China. Another example is technical capability. So we know China's military is modernizing rapidly. So airmen who have relevant technological expertise on, whether it's missiles or some new technology that the PLA could be integrating, that'll help provide the edge in some of their operational employment, right? So those are some areas that commanders can definitely benefit from.
And Dr. Matthews, the report makes some recommendations. What would be different in the Air Force, say 5 years from now, if they follow your recommendations?
Well, it would be a change in how individuals are tracked so that the Air Force would be better able to change its personnel systems to track the individuals who have expertise and what expertise that is. The second kind of course of action or recommendation that we provided was to better handle training and education. Currently, there are programs all over the place that are potentially educating airmen on China. It's not always clear who is getting what, and it's not always clear that those different programs are terribly effective. So those are two of the main things would be that we need to get better at tracking and we need to get better at training and development. So how the Air Force determines what needs to be known about China and then how we get to that place. I think those would be the key elements that if in 5 years, there could be some change in that. But I also caution that just trying to do a quick win is what can be problematic. So recognizing that some of these changes will take long-term, systematic, very thoughtful changes to really be able to change a system that has been working in this fashion, as we learned from this report and from our research, for decades, to try and just spin up on regional expertise as fast as possible and worry about the rest of it later, tracking, promotions, whatnot. So it might not just take 5 years. It might be a much longer term, more considered effort that has to be incorporated into every stage of the system.
Miriam Matthews is a senior behavioral and social scientist at RAND. Christina Garafola is a senior policy researcher at RAND and professor of policy analysis at the RAND School of Public Policy. We'll post this interview and a link to their report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, a PCS move can test a family's finances, routines, and support systems all at once. But first, after a tough year for federal senior executives, new leadership at SEA is looking at what comes next. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. I'm Eric White filling in for Terry. On the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton here on Federal News Network. I'm Eric White filling in for Terry. Federal senior executives are coming out of a demanding year with mission changes, retirements, and rising expectations across agencies. That pressure is reshaping how SES leaders approach their roles and forcing a reset inside the organization that supports them. Dr. Michelle Sutter, Executive Director of the Senior Executives Association, joined Federal Drive host Terry Gerton to talk about what comes next for SES leaders and how SEA is adjusting.
You are in an interesting spot there at the Senior Executive Association. The last year has been a tough one for senior executives across the federal service. When you think about all of the things that group is navigating, retirements, leadership gaps, changes in performance management, we can talk about all of them. But when you look at that environment, what on earth possessed you to say, yes, now is the time that I want to jump in and take on a leadership responsibility?
Sure. So I honestly saw this as a pivotal moment for the senior executive community. Agencies are being asked to move faster, operate leaner, manage uncertainty, and still deliver results at a very high level. And at the same time, we are seeing a tremendous amount of transition, right? Like you just noted, across government, whether that is retirements, leadership turnover, or evolving workforce expectations. So for me, this role was an opportunity to help strengthen the infrastructure around executive leadership at a time when that support truly does matter. SEA has credibility, history, and a strong mission. And what drew me in was the chance to help position the organization, not just as an advocacy voice, but as a practical partner for executives navigating real operational and leadership challenges every single day. And I also felt strongly that my background across operations, workforce strategy, and organizational leadership positioned me to really help SEA continue evolving in a way that is not only sustainable, but also member-focused and execution-driven.
Let's talk about your background a little bit, because you have served in a variety of federal positions. You've been in military leadership. You've been in nonprofit management. How do you bring all of those different perspectives to the work that's in front of SEA? And how do you want to help senior executives today kind of build their profile as well?
Sure. So what I will say is that my experience really does shape almost everything about how I lead. One thing that I have learned from being in those environments that they all have in common is accountability. And at the end of the day, leaders are responsible for execution, outcomes, and most importantly, people. My experience taught me that leadership is not just about strategy conversations. It's about translating strategy into action, building trust, managing through ambiguity, and keeping organizations moving even when resources are scarce and priorities shift constantly. So that perspective aligns closely with the reality that senior executives are facing every single day. SCS leaders are balancing mission delivery, workforce issues, political transitions, operational pressures, and public expectations all at the same time. So my approach at SCA is very practical. I want the organization to be responsive, credible, solution oriented, and deeply connected to what executives are actually experiencing across government.
You just walked through a lot of coordinated pressure on the SCS core, plus it's about 1,000 people smaller than it used to be.
Right.
When you think about all of the challenges, all of the pressures that SCSs are facing today, are you seeing them shape their work or their approach to federal leadership differently?
Sure, absolutely. And I think that's because pressure is coming from multiple directions simultaneously. Like I said previously, there is the operational pressure of delivering results in an environment that's very complex across government right now. There's workforce pressure around recruitment, retention, morale, and even readiness. And there's also the broader expectation that agencies modernize and adapt faster than they were ever expected to before. So what that means for SCS leaders is that the role has become even more dynamic. Executives are no longer just managing programs. They're also leading organizations through constant change while maintaining continuity, accountability, and most importantly, mission focus. I also think executives are being asked to communicate differently. Employees want transparency, and rightly so. Stakeholders want responsiveness, and rightly so. And agencies are under heightened scrutiny. So leadership today requires both operational discipline, but also a very human approach to leading people through uncertainty.
I'm speaking with Dr. Michelle Sutter. She's the executive director for the Senior Executive Association. Michelle, let's shift a little from describing the environment to talking specifically about the Senior Executive Association. You took over as the executive director just back in April, so you haven't been there very long at all. As you've gotten your feet under you, where do you see the biggest opportunity for SEA to support the SES community that's facing all of those challenges you just walked through?
Sure, absolutely. I think the opportunity is in being very intentional about where SEA adds the most value. We don't have to be everything to everyone to have impact. For me, that means focusing on three major things, which is strong advocacy, meaningful executive engagement, and targeted professional development and support opportunities that reflect the realities of not only what executives are facing right now, but also senior leaders and aspiring leaders. So it also means building smarter partnerships and creating programming that is very strategic and sustainable rather than trying to scale too quickly. One of my priorities is making sure SCA remains both influential and operationally sound. If we're thoughtful about alignment, partnerships, and membership engagement, we can continue growing our impact while still protecting the long-term sustainability of the organization.
Not only have you just been there a short time, but SEA is also preparing to onboard a new president. Mm-hmm. How will the two of you, as a new leadership team for this organization, set a new agenda, divide the work, focus your efforts?
Sure. So I think, of course, transitions are a very important moment for any organization. And I think the key alignment between myself and Mary Kate is communication. Mary Kate brings a strong leadership background, a deep understanding of government, and a true passion of advocacy and executive leadership. My role as executive director is to ensure we have operational continuity, strong coordination, and a clear path as we move into this next chapter. And I view the relationship between the board of directors, the president, and the executive director as a partnership. Everyone has distinct responsibilities, but we have to remain aligned around the mission, priorities, and membership value. And if we focus on membership and providing what our members need, the goal should be sustainability, momentum, and confidence that SCA is continuing to evolve in a thoughtful and strategic way.
You described this transition as moving into a new chapter. What will be different, do you think, over the coming 6 to 12 months as SEA reshapes and reorganizes a little bit? What are you going to try to do differently, certainly given all of the disruption over the past year?
Sure. I think the focus for us and what we're going to continue to do is ensure that SEA is viewed as a trusted professional home for executives at every stage of leadership. So for current SES members, that means advocacy, community, and meaningful engagement with peers who understand the complexity of executive leadership in government. For aspiring leaders, I want SEA to help kind of demystify leadership at the senior level and create opportunities for mentorship, development, and connection. And most importantly, I want people to feel supported. Leadership, as we know, can be extremely isolating, especially in high pressure environments. SEA has an opportunity to help executives, senior leaders, and aspiring leaders to stay connected, informed, and grounded while continuing to lead through change and delivering services to the American people.
What sort of professional development opportunities do you think are most essential for both current SES leaders and those who might aspire to executive leadership that the federal government is not providing for them?
Well, in this environment right now, as we know, the federal government is doing so much more with less, and that puts agencies in a predicament to where they're not able to pay for training as they would in the past. So the key focus is hard and soft skills. So providing developmental opportunities that are focused on hard skills related to specific job series, and also the support aspect of it too, the soft skills, being able to ensure that executives and senior leaders and aspiring leaders have the tools that they need to lead in a way to where they have that human touch, to where employees don't just feel like a number. They feel like they're genuinely cared about. And that's really important for us at SEA, is to provide the tools for our members to be successful running day-to-day operations.
Dr. Michelle Sutter is the Executive Director of the Senior Executive Association. We'll post this interview at our website at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive on demand. You can go wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, a PCS move can test a family's finances, routines, and support systems all at once. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. I'm Eric White filling in for Terry. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. I'm Eric White filling in for Terry. PCS moves can put real strain on military families, from unexpected costs to the impact on careers and kids. Sarah Roeder, Director of Partnerships and Member Engagement at Armed Forces Mutual, joined Federal Drive host Terry Gerton to explain where families get caught off guard and what helps smooth the transition.
You know, summer change of station moving is right around the corner for a lot of military families. From your perspective there at Armed Forces Mutual, what do you see as families begin to approach this? Why is this so challenging for so many of them?
As we call it, PCS season, like you said, is upon us. And for the military community, such as myself, I'm a military spouse. I have done several PCS moves. And it's so challenging for our community because we're moving every 2 to 4 years, right? So we're kind of constantly on the go. But a lot of it comes down to the financial aspects of moving. When you're having to move at a cadence like that, there are a lot of financial things that come into play. And so we see at Armed Forces Mutual, our families sometimes finding themselves in financial stress or feeling the financial burden of a PCS move. And like I said, you're doing this in the cadence of every 2 to 4 years. And so that adds up. That's a lot of dollars. And so that's one of the things that we see as a stressor when it comes to PCSing.
Moving that frequently is one way to make sure you don't accumulate a lot of stuff or fill up a basement. But as you say, it can present some financial challenges. The military does reimburse a lot of the costs associated with permanent change of station. But talk to us about some of those unreimbursable costs or non-reimbursed costs that do present families with additional financial challenge.
Yes. So I'll tell you myself, as a very new military spouse, I very naively thought that, well, the military is going to take care of everything, right? Everything that I need to move. And they do, like you said, take care of a lot of those expenses. But every time you move, there's always the unexpected. For myself, one of the things that I found that was a very unexpected thing was, and you don't realize, is when you're moving was the re-enrollment of everything. So if you have children and you're moving, you have to re-enroll them into sports, right? They play sports, they're active, you want to be a part of the community, re-enrolling into sports activities, buying new uniforms, right? Getting integrated into a school and buying new school supplies sometimes. Setting up a home, right? As we move, especially as military spouse, you want to set up your home and you want it to feel comfortable and nice. And so with that, you realize my couch that fit in my last home does not fit into my new space that I've just moved into. And so you're unexpectedly having to buy furniture to fit into new spaces. And so these are kind of the additional, I guess you could say, hidden costs sometimes that we don't realize that we will experience. And in understanding it, you can plan a little bit ahead of time and say, I need to have a buffer. I need to have a financial buffer so that when I move and I hit these unexpected things, it doesn't feel burdensome or more stressful. It's already a stressful time. Trying to alleviate some stress, this is a great way to do that. I'll tell you, even one time our goods were supposed to arrive at a certain, date and time, and they were a week late. And I didn't account for having an extra week's worth of clothes. And so it was finding, where do I wash these clothes? Or I need to go to Target and buy new clothes because we're out. And so these are just kind of all the little tiny things that happen as you go through these moves every 2 to 4 years, like our military families do.
I remember thinking about things like all of the condiments in your refrigerator that you have to throw away and replace.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
I thought it was about mayonnaise.
Yeah, it can be as simple as mayonnaise. And these are the things that, if we can plan a little bit, right? As I became a more seasoned military spouse and realized, I need to have a financial buffer because I am going to have to replace the mayonnaise, right? And re-enroll in the schools and do all this stuff was, planning ahead for that and making sure I had additional funds so that it didn't feel as stressful.
Sarah Roeder is Director of Partnerships and Member Engagement at Armed Forces Mutual. Sarah, you've said a couple of times that you're a military spouse. Let's talk about the impact of this move on the spouse themselves, trying to maintain a career through repeated moves. What actually helps as spouses navigate this transition?
Yeah. So I have done that, right? Looked for work and new duty stations and tried to, actively be a part of the workforce outside of my home. And there's a lot of challenges when it comes to being a military spouse and working outside of the home. I'll give you a quick little data point here. The Department of Labor says that it takes, on average, a military spouse 19 weeks to find work and secure employment after relocation. That's about 4 months, right? So that's 4 months of lost income. That's 4 months of time. So I think one of the biggest things that as a military spouse we can do is knowing that it's going to take us time and starting that process early. 4 to 6 months before a move. We live in such a digital world now with Teams and Zooms, and you can interview across the country for jobs. It's doing that ahead of time, really starting to look at the community you're going to be moving into and start your job hunt 4 to 6 months beforehand. One of the great resources I encourage every military spouse to check out is the Military Spouse Employment Partnership portal through the DoD, MSEP. It is a list of about 1,000 companies that say, we actively want to hire military spouses. We want to hire them. We realize that you're going to move. We realize that you're capable, wonderful workers, but you live a transient lifestyle across, the world, and that's okay. And so they are companies that when you initially are applying or looking for employment there, you don't have to be worried or scared to say you're a military spouse. You can be very proud of that. And you can search by, geographic location. And so I would say that's one of the biggest things as a military spouse is looking for employment well before your move to get a head start.
And Sarah, you also talked about the impact on kids. What helps smooth that transition into a new community and school when young children are involved in the move as well?
That's a hard one, right? Our kids are really resilient, and we know that, but we still have to support them and have a network. One of the things that I found that was a great resource in communities was the sports aspect. My boys love to play sports, and so that was a great way to tie immediately into a community and into a school system. But another one of those great touch points was Blue Star Families has something called Coffee Connects. You can look on their website and find where the Coffee Connect in your installation is. And it's a very casual setting at a coffee house locally where military spouses come. If they have really little kids who aren't in school, they bring them. If it happens to be on a weekend, you can bring all of the children. And it was a great resource to feel like the second you walked in, I didn't have to explain myself. Everyone was the same as me in a sense. We're all military spouses. We're all moving. We're all starting over, every 2 to 4 years, trying to get our footing. And it was a really nice way to meet other military spouses in the community and other families, right? And so we can be the connection point for our children to help them establish the play dates and meeting other friends and things like that. And so those were two really big things that I leaned on personally was the sports and then being a part of kind of Coffee Connects or community activities.
Last summer around this time, DoD was making a lot of changes to the moving contractors associated with military moves. There's always something happening in the PCS space. Where can military families get the latest info, and how can they use that to best prepare for a move that they know is going to happen?
Yeah, so that's great. And like you said, the DoD has a great place, that you can go and look at that. But I'll be really honest. I think one of the most helpful things was looking to social media. Quite honestly, I think that when we look at certain Facebook groups or even in the Blue Star Families neighborhood within the community you're about to move, asking how other people's moves went, asking how did that in the last 2 weeks, right? How did your move actually go? Who was your provider that you were using? What did it look like? Were your goods delayed? Were they not? Did you get reimbursed? I think is a great way to really actually know kind of the boots on the ground, what's happening. Because I think a lot of times, right, we look to the guidelines of what should be happening. And a lot of times what should happen doesn't quite translate over. And so I personally want to hear from the individual that just went through it. And I want to know what was your experience, and then I can best prepare for that. So that's my recommendation. Those are the things that I leaned on as a military spouse. Anytime there was a change, a regulatory change or a change in anything, yes, I can look that up, but I want to hear from the people that are going through it, right? And so I found through social media, there's lots of avenues to do that. And Blue Star Families has Blue Star Family Neighborhood, which is kind of a secure site for military spouses to be able to go into and talk about these things. And that was a great resource.
Sarah Roeder is Director of Partnerships and Member Engagement at Armed Forces Mutual. We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. 3 recent solicitations offer an interesting glimpse into the Trump administration's influence on federal procurement. From the overhaul of the federal acquisition regulations to the push for consolidation and centralization, these 3 requests for proposals demonstrate how agencies are implementing and accepting the Office of Management and Budget's prioritization of reforming federal technology and acquisition management. In his reporter's notebook, Executive Editor Jason Miller writes about how the RFPs from Commerce, Treasury, and GSA are demonstrating the changes that are happening, and Jason joins me now to discuss. Jason, welcome aboard.
Thanks, Eric.
So why these 3 RFPs? What stood out about them, and what made you want to look into them and write about them?
I think there's three things that really kind of stood out to me. First of all, they're all for big technology acquisition type of projects, and those always are attractive. They gain a lot of interest in the community. A lot of people want to talk about them. Second, we'll get into this later, they were hidden behind the firewall that's called eBuy. Eric, I'm not going to get on my soapbox right now. I'll do that later. So that really makes it also interesting because they're not necessarily easy to find, and I think that it really does show that GSA, Treasury, Commerce really aiming for a specific set of vendors, not wired or anything, but just on the schedules contract as an example. But third, and this is really where it stood out to me, and this is what clicked among those three, is each of them in their own way are saying, hey, the administration wants to change the way acquisition is done. We've talked about the FAR overhaul, the rewrite. Hey, here's new ways to approach acquisitions. And each of those kind of take a piece of it and show how that's being pushed into actual implementation. And that's what's really important here. So many times OMB, and this is not to pick on OMB, but they put out a policy, and then what happens from that policy? We hear that time and again from federal executives, former federal executives. The proof will be in the pudding, Eric. The rubber will hit the road. And I think these three just showed me, hey, look, here's an example of that rubber actually hitting the road.
All right, so let's break them down. Why don't we start with the Commerce Department? Tell us a little bit about the project that RFP is involved with and what's going on there.
Two things about the Commerce acquisition that stood out to me. Number one, they actually put an announcement out on sam.gov to say, hey, we're going to be doing this against the GSA schedule. So kudos to Commerce for at least telling folks from a transparency perspective that this is their plan versus just hiding behind that wall that's called eBuy. So this is a new cloud vehicle. It's embodying several of the administration's goals. It's consolidating multiple cloud contracts across the Commerce into one blanket purchase agreement. This is going to be a 10-year contract with a ceiling of $4.1 billion. It's going out as a blanket purchase agreement or a BPA under GSA schedules contract. Again, utilizing the FAR deviation that allows agencies to create BPAs on top of schedule contracts. So there's a good example of rubber hitting the road. Commerce is also saying, hey, we're going to embrace this idea of contracting directly with OEMs, original equipment manufacturers. Now, obviously, cloud, there's no quote-unquote equipment, but they want to contract directly with cloud service providers versus going through, an example, a value-added reseller, going through a third-party systems integrator. And again, the administration has been very clear about wanting to do business with the companies that are providing that product or service versus, again, a third party. So I think those are two things that really stood out to me. Now, what they're trying to do basically is unclear because we can't see the entire RFP. We can know that they're trying to do a couple things like deal with the massive compute elasticity needs. They have huge global backbones. They have specific hardware for AI and machine learning and weather modeling. So there's a lot there that they're trying to do through this approach. So I think the fact is they're taking several contracts and consolidating them. In fact, I talked to the acting chief technology officer at Commerce, Mathis Passos, and he talks about that cloud is a huge spend under the Commerce Department's budget. Their IT budget was $2.9 billion in 2025. So cloud is a big piece of that. And he said, listen, it's gotten to the point where we can't really defend having different contracts with different prices and different terms and conditions. And we want to drive toward this idea of one commerce for all common IT services like cloud computing. And then we want the flexibility that comes with buying cloud services. He said that the Commerce Department actually put together an internal working group led by NIST and NOAA to really help lead this effort. So again, Eric, we're looking at different examples of how the administration is pursuing or wants agencies to pursue specific directions, and here's evidence that they're doing that.
Speaking here with Federal News Network Executive Editor Jason Miller. All right, and what about Treasury and GSA? Tell us a little bit more about those RFPs.
Let me start with Treasury first. This is also very interesting because this goes into the consolidation and centralization bucket of the administration's policies. What Treasury is doing is that, again, they put a blanket purchase agreement out on top of a GSA schedule, again, using the deviation in the FAR that the FAR overhaul really established. And their goal is to consolidate disparate core financial management systems into something called One FM. Now, this will be for all of Treasury, but also, and this is where it's really important, they want to act as a shared service for 34 other agencies. And these other agencies range from like HUD, which is a pretty big agency, to NARA, which is a medium-sized agency, to a lot of smaller and micro agencies like the Consumer Product Safety Commission. So again, they're going to provide core financial management systems, one system for all of these agencies. Again, I'll say very similar to what we're seeing, Eric, with the HR IT effort that OPM is pursuing as well, where they're trying to have one HR system for all of government. Now, again, this goes back to the 2025 executive order from March that President Donald Trump signed, calling for, among other things, the consolidation of agency financial management systems. Now, the Bureau of Fiscal Service is leading this effort. They want basically a approved software as a service core financial management solution, and they're looking for a lot of services around it. Treasury estimates it could spend roughly just under about $1 billion, $987 million on this entire effort to consolidate existing systems which come from Oracle, SAP, and even one that the IRS developed in-house. So again, I think this is really what's interesting about this is not just that, hey, we're going to have a shared service, but here's a clear signal of how that consolidation will work. The second one I want to talk real quick about is a solicitation from GSA's Technology Transformation Service. It's called their Next Generation IT Solutions, BPA, or NEXT. Now, I wrote about this back in February, and basically what they're trying to do is say we're going to have a multiple word contract and or a single word contract, depending on the functional areas, to provide different technology services, everything from DevSecOps and modern software deployment to digital services and experience design and delivery to cloud infrastructure and cyber services to digital identity and fraud protection. And of course, Eric, you know, it has to be AI strategy and implementation. Now, this 5-year contract has a ceiling of about $700 million. And what GSA TTS is doing is they're looking at some of the more innovative procurement techniques that have been highlighted in the FAR overhaul and in the associated practitioners' albums, and they're going to use them, like the periodical table of acquisition innovation. They're going to look at multi-phase quote submission evaluations, advisory down selects. Eric, none of this is blowing my mind here, but again, you've got to do it. You've got to exercise these muscles and really put it out there. And I think all three of them, Commerce, Treasury, GSA, TTS, are just great examples of the rubber hitting the road. I'll use that cliche for you.
Are there any folks who don't think they're so great and think that maybe those agencies might be overstretching a bit in these reformed proposals, should we call them? What are some of the frustrations that are being voiced about them?
As you know, Eric, with any large procurement, any multiple word procurement, you are going to face some challenges around bid protests. Let's just take the Commerce Department one. That's maybe a little bit easier because they're opening the door to all the main hyperscale service providers. So you're not going to have a situation where the DoD did several years ago with its JEDI procurement, where they wanted to award one contract and then add others later. Commerce is opening the door for, hey, if you are a hyperscale cloud service provider, we'll talk to you. GSA TTS may be facing a tougher choice because a lot of these technology services that they're asking for are done by a lot of different contractors. Some are small business set-asides, some are not. They are trying to limit awards to maybe 5 per category in some cases. And again, there's a lot of people who provide these services, so they can be facing a lot of different potential protests. Treasury and the financial management one, there are fewer companies that have a approved financial management system that can really serve large agencies like this. But again, very similar to what we're seeing with OPM. Trying to go down to one is always difficult because the vendors mean they feel like they're getting locked out. Now, then there's the bigger frustration, Eric, and this is where I told you I would get to this later. I will pull out my soapbox and I will step on it. The biggest frustration among all three of these procurements is they're behind the firewall of eBuy. And I know people are, argue with me and debate with me why that's okay. But the more people I talk to, including former feds who now see it from my experiences, is hiding behind eBuy and not putting this out so everyone can see really does a disservice to the agencies, and it does a disservice for the broader federal community. I will not, if people want to read about my rants, I've done this many times on paper and on the air. I will not step forward, but I will ask GSA, I'll ask Laura Stanton, the acting commissioner of FAS, tear down that eBuy wall once and for all.
All right, we'll stand by and wait for that next soapbox cheer. Federal News Network Executive Editor Jason Miller, thank you as always.
My pleasure, Eric.
And you can find more of Jason's reporting and his reporter's notebook at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by me, Eric White, along with Michelle Sandifor. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Eric White filling in for Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.